Greetings, Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the history of the Catholic Church in the United States in the 20th century. Moving into the 29th president, Warren Gamaliel Harding was sworn in on March 4th, 1921. Born in Corsica, Ohio, on November 2nd, 1865, attended Ohio Central College, then studied law, worked as editor and publisher of a newspaper, the Marion Star. Harding entered local politics in Ohio as a Republican. He was Baptist by religious practice. Ran for and won and served in the Ohio State Senate, then ran for and won the position of the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Ohio, then ran and won a position as one of the two senators from Ohio in 1914. He won a landslide victory in the presidential election of 1920 by promising a, quote, return to normalcy, his words, after the First World War. He was pro-business in his philosophy, but like Grant, was poorly served by men he trusted because he thought they were friends. Harding was personally honest, but his administration was plagued by scandal, so very similar to Grant in that regard. His Attorney General, his Secretary of the Interior, and the Director of the Veterans Bureau were all indicted. In the midst of this, Harding suffered a stroke and died on August 2nd, 1923, followed by his vice president, in his first term, before he finished his first term. So his first term was finished by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, whom we will get to momentarily. But later the same year that he was sworn in, August 11th, 1920, a Catholic priest, Father James Coyle, C-O-Y-L-E, was murdered he was fatally shot on the porch of his rectory in Birmingham, Alabama. The murderer was a Southern Methodist Episcopal minister, the Reverend E.R. Stevenson. The murder occurred just hours after Coyle had performed a wedding between the Reverend Stevenson's daughter Ruth and Pedro Guzman, an American from Puerto Rico. Several months before the wedding, Ruth had enraged her father, the Reverend Stevenson, by converting to Catholicism. The Reverend Stevenson was defended in the trial by a lawyer named Hugo Black, who was a future justice in the U.S. Supreme Court. Hugo Black was a clade of the KKK Clavern, meaning he was an initiator of new members in his home state of Alabama. Hugo Black, in Alabama, was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1926 after he built a political base, in part, through his delivery of 148 speeches at local Klan gatherings, where his focus was denunciation of Catholicism as a foreign conspiracy. As a Supreme Court justice, Black has been accused, or has been, supposed by some writers, of allowing his anti-Catholic bias to influence key decisions regarding separation of church and state issues. Following year, excuse me. Allergies. On January 22nd, 1922, Pope Benedict XV died. He was followed by Pope 259, Pius XI, who reigned until 1939. On May 30th, 1922, the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. It's still there. It's just, same one that's there. Present were the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William Howard Taft, former president, and Robert Todd Lincoln, representing the family. The Lincoln Memorial has 48 sculptured festoons above the columns, representing the number of states at the time of dedication. It has 36 columns constructed in the Doric Greek style, representing the number of states in the Union at the time of Lincoln's assassination in 1865. It is constructed of limestone and marble. It is situated at the western end of the mall, was designed by Henry Bacon of North Carolina in the style of a Greek temple. A co-designer was Daniel Chester French. So it's a classic, if you go to D.C., so worth seeing. Regardless of, anyway, that's right. So Coolidge, President number 30, March 4th, 1929. Coolidge, John Calvin Coolidge, was born on the family farm in Vermont, July 4th, 1872. He was born into a very disciplined Calvinist family, Congregationalist, as they would have called them in Vermont. Completed his higher education at Amherst College in 1895, embarked on the practice of law in Massachusetts, entered local politics as a Republican, achieved election as lieutenant governor and then governor, before becoming vice president to Warren Harding in 1920. When Harding died, as we covered previously, in 1923, Coolidge finished his term, then another term in his own right in 1924. Solidly pro-business, he appointed Andrew Mellon, Mellon, as Secretary of the Treasury, and gave him wide latitude in setting financial and commercial policy, declaring, quote, that the business of America is business, unquote. Coolidge died a private citizen at his home in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1933. During his term, on February 22, 1924, President Calvin Coolidge delivered the first presidential address via radio from the White House. So he addressed the country through over 42 radio stations. On April 23, 1924, the U.S. Senate passed the Soldier's Bonus Bill, but deferred payments to 4 million veterans until 1945. I mean, that was written in the text. Coolidge vetoed the bill, but Congress overrode the veto. Same year, following month, March 24th, 1924, 2 Americans were named to the College of Cardinals. The first, Patrick Joseph Hayes, was Archbishop of New York from 1919 until his death in 1938. And within that, in 1924, he became a cardinal. So this guy was born in 1867. He was best known for his work in expanding and organizing the Catholic Charities program in the Archdiocese of New York, which became a model for other dioceses in the country. Born himself in New York City, the son of Irish immigrants, when he was age 5, his mother died, so he was sent to live with relatives. He attended parish schools, parochial schools, conducted by the Christian Brothers, graduated in 1888 from Manhattan College. To study for the priesthood, he attended the Diocesan Seminary in Troy, New York, was ordained for the Archdiocese in New York in 1892. 2 years later, he earned a licentiate in theology from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Following that, his first assignment was to St. Gabriel's Parish in New York City, serving under John Farley. When Farley became auxiliary bishop of New York in 1895, he requested from the Archbishop, and of course it was approved, that Father Hayes, the future Cardinal Hayes, be his secretary. After the Archbishop in New York at the time died, Archbishop Michael Corrigan, whom we covered previously, Farley succeeded to his post. So the same guy then became Archbishop of New York. And Father Hayes, followed him again to be his secretary, his arcanus, his kind of private secretary. Later, Father Hayes served as diocesan chancellor and president of the new preparatory seminary. In 1914, Hayes was consecrated auxiliary bishop in New York, and in 1919 followed Farley yet again as archbishop of the diocese. During the First World War, Hayes was named Bishop of the American Armed Forces and mobilized a group of 900 Catholic chaplains. He also served on the administrative board of the NCWC, the National Catholic War Council, which coordinated Catholic war work at home and abroad. Hayes was one of the signers, so therefore a supporter, of the Bishop's Program for Social Reconstruction, which we covered previously, a set of proposals for post-war social reforms issued in the name of the Catholic hierarchy in 1919, heavily influenced, as we covered, by the secular progressive movement in the U.S. In his 20 years as Archbishop in New York, Hayes devoted himself largely to local matters. He was an institution builder. By temperament, by personality, he was a very private person, very introverted. So he was not one to seek the spotlight. He did not involve himself in national controversies. With the assistance of one of his priests, Father Robert J. Keegan, he completed the centralization and incorporation of the diocesan charities, which in his time numbered over 200 agencies, providing a model for other prelates and other dioceses. Appointed to the College of Cardinals in 1924, which is why I'm talking about him at this point, he was referred to by his contemporaries as the Cardinal of Charities. Occasionally, Cardinal Hayes did speak out on public issues, but only those which he felt involved moral principles or somehow involved the welfare of the church. He never spoke out on things that he regarded as purely political. He opposed prohibition. He backed legislation to limit indecency on the stage, so supporting censorship. He denounced publicly the American Birth Control League in 1935. He was he also endorsed unemployment relief during the Depression, which many conservatives opposed, just on principle, because they didn't want the government. They didn't want the government doing that at all. They didn't want the extra taxes that would be required for the government to do that, and they did not want. They believed that would encourage people to malinger, if they thought they could get paid anyway. He died on September 4th, 1938. The second American named to the College of Cardinals in that year was George William Mundelein, Mundelein. Born in New York City on July 2nd, 1872. So born in the United States, but both of his parents were immigrants, in his case, German immigrants. He also graduated from Manhattan College in 1889. He then attended St. Vincent's Seminary in Beatty, Pennsylvania, completed his priestly formation at the Urban College in Rome, received a doctorate of divinity, and was ordained a priest in 1895. He returned to his home diocese of Brooklyn to serve as secretary to Bishop Charles E. McDonnell. He was appointed chancellor and auxiliary bishop of the Diocese of Brooklyn in 1909. He then he became Archbishop in New York in 1915, following James Edward Quigley, whom we covered earlier in the 19th century. Mundelein was noted as an administrator, a fundraiser. Today it'd be called a workaholic. He built literally hundreds of schools, churches, hospitals, charitable institutions to keep pace with the needs of his rapidly growing archdiocese. Chicago was not only on one of the Great Lakes, but it was also a railroad nexus. So it became like one of those, like a gateway city. So it got trade going both ways. He founded a preparatory seminary, what we call a high school seminary today, Quigley, named for his predecessor, Quigley Preparatory Seminary in 1918. And it was soon the largest in the nation in terms of enrollment. In 1921, he established a major seminary, what we call today a theologate, St. Mary of the Lake, which he regarded as the crowning achievement of his career. He was appointed to the College of Cardinals in 1924, and he had used the occasion for a fundraising campaign for the seminary and raised $1 million, and that's in 1924 money. 2 years later, he presided over a Eucharistic Congress in Chicago, one of the largest religious meetings in history up to that point in the United States. In 1918, he launched the Associated Catholic Charities of Chicago. He supported the work of Big Brothers, an organization called Big Brothers, in which the Holy Name Society, which is a confraternity of laymen, Catholic men, served as friends and advisors to economically disadvantaged and often fatherless young men. He sponsored the first diocesan council of the Legion of Decency, which pushed for censorship of movies, radio, stage, writing. He was still there in Chicago when the Depression erupted in 1929, and diocesan agencies of Chicago worked very closely with government programs aimed at relief and reform. So like Hayes, he was one of those that believed in a synthesis of the secular progressive ideas of government involvement to fix social ills with the church. That was a good idea. Always keenly aware of the presence of social injustice, because what his immigrant parents endured. Mundelein, though in many ways he was conservative, but in social issues he was what today would be considered a liberal. That he was a vocal public advocate in denouncing exploitation of labor, especially immigrant labor. And he was still in office when Franklin Roosevelt, initiated the New Deal. And Mundelein was a strong supporter, as a Catholic cardinal, of the New Deal, government involvement in social affairs and managing social and economic affairs, and which some of his fellow bishops regarded as, a socialist. He was actually I hate to say friend because, say a public ally of Roosevelt. He visited the White House many times, and he publicly defended Roosevelt's programs against Catholic critics who believed that it was just an entryway for socialist and communist subversion. In 1937, Mundelein again broke from some members of the hierarchy who were isolationist in the period between the two world wars, that those who did not want to get involved in another world war. But Mundelein, even his parents were German, he nevertheless vigorously denounced Nazism in general and Hitler in particular, arguing that the Nazis, that there was a difference between the Nazis and Germany, that the Nazis, that was a malevolent movement that invaded Germany. And the Archdiocese of Chicago became a center for social action programs with Catholic priests and other leaders supporting the unions, the drive to unionize labor. Actually, he permitted priests to serve on the Committee for the Industrial Organization of Labor, which was an aggregation of trade unions. He was one of these very publicly active in civic affairs. Whenever there's a big event in Chicago, he'd be there. Not just Catholic events, but he was like a civic figure. He stayed in Chicago till his death. He died on October 2nd, 1939. Okay, that's it. Same year as Hayes and Mundelein were appointed to the College of Cardinals, 1924. On July 4th, the Conference for Progressive Political Action held its first national convention in Cleveland, Ohio, the CPPA. So this is the secular progressive, economic, social, political. And it ended, this first national convention ended in nominating one of their members to run for president. Now, this guy was already a senator, Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. He ran and he won 17% of the popular vote, but was defeated by the former governor of Massachusetts and vice president of Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge. Nevertheless, this represented an escalation of the progressive movement, that they were actually going to try to form a third party. So this progressive platform, this is the post-First World War secular progressive movement in the United States, represented an alliance of Midwestern farmers who were populist, rural populist, with labor rights advocates, with women's rights advocates, with humanitarian advocates who wanted to limit and ultimately eliminate child labor by law. The working day, the limits on the working day, which is part of the labor movement. Also, the CPPA pushed for public ownership, not government, meaning government ownership of public utilities and railroads. That really made people nervous. That sounds, that's like page one of socialism and communism. They believe, that some who oppose that would say that, that's un-American. That should be the free market, and then the people, the citizens would decide whichever one offered the best deal. But the progressives, so the governments, then and now, those are the mindset believe that the government is not only the proper way that these things should be done, but the best way these things should be done. Okay. All right, catching up with Mexico. I think we last left them on May 21st, 1920, where the president of Mexico was assassinated. That's Venustiano Carranza. And Mexico was plunged into another round of limitless slaughter. And this was followed by the Caseros War, 1926 to 1929. So when Carranza was assassinated, a guy named Alvaro Obregón, if I'm mispronouncing it, I'm sorry. He was elected president of Mexico on September 5th, 1920. He was recognized by the United States as president of Mexico on condition that he respect American commercial interests in Mexico. Time passed. 1924, new president of Mexico, Plutarco Calles, Calles. 2 years later, February 11th, 1926, the Mexican legislature passed a law nationalizing all church property. The law was set to go into effect the following year, on January 1st, 1927. Further, it passed laws contrary to American interest, not just Catholic interest. One example being the Petroleum Law, which was limited commercial concessions to foreign-owned businesses to 50 years. And foreign-owned companies operating in Mexico were to forfeit their ownership if they appealed for help to their home government against the Mexican government. Further, in 1927, the Mexican legislature passed the land law. Remember, I talked about that, how that oscillation, not just in Mexico, but all of Latin America. I focus on Mexico because we share, this is, of course, in U.S. history, and we share a border with them, but almost every an overwhelming majority of the number of Latin American countries have gone through that same pendulum, swept back and forth between the conservative military, pro large landowning elite, and then on the other side, the communist supported land reform types, meaning confiscate the big estates and break them up, to create a class of farmers, and the land law was a repetition of this. So that this time it's on the left of the seizure of the large estates. That this is both of the haciendas of the secular elite, as well as the large estates owned by foreign interests, and it would have the church that stolen the church property. Nationalized the church property the previous year, but it would have included that. So in the context of this, September 1927, same year, that's President Coolidge appointed Dwight W. Morrow, Morrow, as ambassador to Mexico. Now, this guy had been on the board of directors of J.P. Morgan Company. Morrow, by means of bribery, secured from the Mexican Congress amendments to the 1927 laws, specifically those pertaining to foreign-owned property in Mexico. He then turned to seeking modification of the anti-Catholic laws, but that was interrupted by the assassination of the President Obregon on July 17, 1928. So, 1925, back to the U.S., 1925. Two noteworthy things that occurred that were specifically anti-Catholic in the United States. August 8th, 1925, the first National Congress of the Ku Klux Klan opened. 200,000 members marched in robes and hoods, marched to Washington, D.C. So the Klan is not only racist, which is, of course, what they're best known for, but also militantly anti-Catholic. Same year, 1925, a Supreme Court case unfolded. This is Pierce, 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 versus the Society of Sisters. So this is 268 U.S. 1925, numbers 583, 584. So if you want to Google this, seminarians, Google the Oregon school case of 1925, or Pierce versus the Society of Sisters. It was argued before the court on March 16th and 17th, 1925, and the decision was rendered on June 1st, 1925. So the background of this, we have to go back a few years to 1922 in the state of Oregon. The Oregon school system, meaning the public school, the state, the government school system, took part in a decision to Americanize their schools. Groups such as the Klan, as well as the Masons, the Scottish Rite Masons in Oregon, organized a system and promoted a system requiring all children between the ages of 8 and 16 to attend public schools, meaning the government schools. To enforce this law, parents and guardians who did not send their children to the public schools, but instead sent them to another private school, either private or religious, would be subject to a $100 fine and up to 30 days in jail. So the statute was challenged, of course. It was challenged in the court. The Society of Sisters of the Holy Name of Jesus and Mary, an order of Catholic nuns, and by a private school that was actually Protestant. I mean, it was mostly, but it was officially a private school, Hill Military Academy. Hill is Hill, Hill. So they challenged it. It went all up through the the state courts. Eventually appealed to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court ruled that Oregon could not constitutionally compel all students to attend only public schools. And that was decided by a unanimous vote of the court. It's rather startling. And that decision was rendered on June 1st, 1925. One of the associate justices, James Clark McReynolds, wrote the opinion that the majority signed, in which he stated, quote, that children are not the mere creatures of the state, and that, end quote, and that by its very nature, the traditional American understanding of the term liberty prevented the state from forcing students to accept instruction only from public schools. Further, he wrote that this responsibility belonged to the child's parents or guardians, and that the ability to make such a choice was a liberty protected by the 14th Amendment. So, this decision must be understood in context to appreciate why it differed from previous decisions, which supported the right of the government to interfere in belief. So faith cannot interfere with government, but government can interfere with faith. The context of this apparent reversal of that was the Oregon school law did not only apply to Catholics and Mormons, which we've seen previous legislation do, just target those. So this law, this Oregon school law, would have had the effect of closing all Protestant schools, as well as all non-religious private schools. Therefore, the Oregon school case decision was not a change in the principle that government can interfere with religion, but religion cannot interfere with government. Rather, it was a federal limitation on state overreach against both private, secular, as well as religious education. So, seminarians, remember, in the American system, separation of church and state means the government can interfere with church, but the church cannot interfere with government. All right. All right. 1925, same year that the case was decided, is another case. This was a state case, not specifically Catholic issues, but it was involved with religion, so I'll mention it. This is informally, if you want to Google it, this is the Scopes Monkey Trial, March 25th, 1925 through July 10th. The actual case was the state of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, Scopes. This was the prosecution. It flowed from the prosecution of a science teacher, the aforementioned John Thomas Scopes, for the offense of teaching evolution by natural selection in a Dayton, Tennessee public school, which a recent bill, the Butler Act, now this is passed by the state legislature in Tennessee, named for the representative, John W. Butler, had made illegal. So the Butler Act in Tennessee made teaching evolution by natural selection a crime. So the state representative, John W. Butler, was a farmer in Tennessee, and he was head of the World Christian Fundamentals Association. He lobbied, and his organization lobbied the state legislature to pass anti-evolution laws, believing that evolution undermined belief in God and the Bible. Now, this guy's not Catholic, but he's a Protestant, a believing Christian. That evolution undermined belief in God, and that since belief in God was also the basis for public morality, that undermining belief in God would have a deleterious effect on both, on not only on faith but also public morality, and that would affect everything else. And he heard, that public teachers who were teaching evolution were mocking the Bible. And that's what set him off. Okay. So the Butler Act was passed by the Tennessee legislature on March 25th, 1925. In response, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, yes, the same one that's still with us today, financed a test case to challenge the Butler Law, in which John Scopes, a Tennessee high school science teacher, agreed to deliberately violate the law and be prosecuted for it. So on May 5th, 1925, Scopes was charged with teaching evolution from a chapter out of a book titled Civic Biology, authored by George William Hunter. That textbook was written in 1914. Three-time presidential nominee, but never presidential victor, William Jennings Bryan volunteered to present for the prosecution. In other words, to prosecute Scopes as a way to defend biblical inerrancy, attacking evolution. So he was already known. William Jennings Bryan was already well known among the Protestant biblical circles, churches, and he was known to be an anti-evolutionist. And he had almost single-handedly created the national controversy over the teaching of evolution and made his name inseparable from that cause. For the defense, defending John Thomas Scopes, was Clarence Darrow. Darrow was already a famous attorney who had recently acted for the defense of the notorious Leopold and Loeb murder trial. There were two students, wealthy students from the University of Chicago, and they were accused of kidnap and murder of the 14-year-old Robert Franks in Chicago in May of 1924. Darrow defended them, and they were both sentenced to life imprisonment instead of death, which was largely attributed to Darrow's arguments against the capital punishment. Loeb, of the two, was, that's his name, Richard Loeb. He was murdered by a fellow prisoner, whereas Leopold, even though it's a first name, in his case it's a last name, Nathan Leopold Jr., made it. He survived to be paroled in 1958. Anyway, so Clarence Darrow was already known. He found out about the Scopes trial through the journalist H.L. Mencken, who suggested that Darrow should defend Scopes because with two famous names, Darrow against Bryan, the case was guaranteed to get national publicity, which both sides of the argument wanted. Bryan and Darrow set the tone by immediately attacking each other in the press as a lead-up before they even went into, so that this was a publicity stunt really for both sides. The ACLU attempted to remove Darrow from the case, even though he was arguing, he was on their side, because they feared they would lose control, that Darrow was just making it, it was like a personal thing between him and Bryan, rather than the principle about intellectual freedom, which is why they defended, they took the case. Anyway, the case went to trial. The trial was set for July 10th. The jury took 9 minutes to pronounce Scopes guilty. He was fined $100. He was offered a new teaching contract, but he chose to leave Dayton. He went to graduate school. He studied geology at the University of Chicago. He graduated and then became a petroleum engineer. Just went on to do other things with his life. However, the controversy over the teaching of science in general and evolution in particular has continued to our own day, in the 21st century. A recent case in this millennium, 2005, the case of Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District, battled over the constitutionality of teaching intelligent design in Pennsylvania schools alongside evolution. This was a Supreme Court case, and in that case, the court ruled against intelligent design, which is the biblical, version, against intelligent design as a legitimate topic suitable for to be conveyed in public education. Once again, supporting non-belief over belief. So the government has a right to interfere with faith, but faith cannot interfere with government. Okay. 1926. Let's see. Yeah, okay. 1926, as a one of the steps that's going to contribute to Vatican II, at least one category of thought at Vatican II. The liturgical movement comes to the United States in 1926. A journal, I picked that date because a journal, that's the date that a journal started to be published, by the Benedictine Abbey of St. John's in Collegeville, Minnesota. Originally, the journal was titled Orate Fratres, Pray Brothers. The name was changed to Worship in 1955. The founding editor was one of the monks at the Abbey. His name was Virgil Michael. Born in Minnesota, ordained 1916. He had been sent to study liturgy at St. Anselmo in Rome. There he was taught by a former labor priest, I mean a labor activist, pro-labor activist priest from Belgium, named Father Lambert Baudouin. Michael brought those ideas, Baudouin's ideas, the liturgical movement, meaning vernacular language, promoting the full conscious active participation in the liturgy among the faithful by having it in their own language instead of Latin. The idea of music, congregational singing, instead of just listening to the choir do Gregorian chant, all that liturgical movement, things that we associate with Vatican II and the post-Vatican II liturgical reforms, had their origin here. In the form that Michael brought the liturgical movement to the United States, it was from what he learned from his teacher. So Father Baudouin was not only a liturgical reformer pushing for the vernacular and sacramental life, but he had also had a prior life, and he never lost interest in the European version of progressivism, the labor rights, which was some considered socialist, so that liberal, socialist, that's the liturgical movement, the social activism, the pro-progressive, all those things synthesized at one end of the ecclesial spectrum in the United States, all associated with liberalism. Whereas it was never 100%. On the other side, you always had, varying in percentages, but they were always there. Those bishops and, Catholics who regarded the progressives, that regarded that as socialist infiltration, which would lead to atheism, therefore fundamentally un-Catholic. So those two attitudes, those two ecclesiologies, existed long before Vatican II. But those two attitudes were present at Vatican II, and the fighting, occurred at Vatican II. And so what happened after Vatican II, the rifts that occurred, and some of which are still with us, it did not just happen. They were there before, and they were there after, and they're still with us. So Vatican II was an occasion, for a slight adjustment, a reconfiguration of pre-existing conflicts. Okay. I hit the wrong thing. What was that? 1927. The Washington Airport opened in D.C., the District of Columbia, next to Hoover Field. The two merged. Hoover Field and Washington Airport merged in 1930 to form the Washington Hoover Airport. 1928 was an election year, so we will pause here because that is going to be the occasion for a Catholic running for president. It's going to trigger another round of eruption of anti-Catholicism. So we will pick up there in the next video. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.